What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Bass Fishing Declassified. I just got done catching really nice fish on the dock here at Beaver Lake, and I want to show you how I fish floating boat docks in the late summer, how I approach them with my casting, boat positioning, everything like that, so you can put a lot more fish in the boat around boat docks this fall. Let's get into it. Okay, so we're coming up to another shallow boat dock here, and I want to show you how I would break this boat dock down. Basically what I'm going to do is take a flipping jig. This is just a motion fishing half-ounce flipping jig with a hand-tied skirt. I like this jig because it has a really nice bait keeper on it, and I put a Strike King Menace grub there. So what I'm basically going to do is try to fish this boat dock from the bank all the way out to the tip to see where these fish are positioning. There's a lot of cables and crosswires when you get closer up to kind of the shore on these docks. So what I'll try to do is just skip that bait underneath the wire and over some of the railings and get to those shady spots. That was not a fish, that was just a bluegill. Or not a bass at least, there's a little bluegill pecking at it. What I'm gonna do is basically just try to skip this bait into those shady pockets over the top of these wires. Now it gets a little bit sketchy on this deal just because if you do get a fish, you're going to have to rip them over those wires, and sometimes you hit the poles and everything. When you do that, you want to double check your jig to make sure your jig hook doesn't bend. And it's kind of hard to get into these docks sometimes, but if you can get back in behind them, a lot of times this is where a lot of these fish are going to be setting up, is kind of in these little shade pockets on this back side here. So I'm going to make a handful of casts. That was a pretty good one, just trying to skip it around, get it back around in this corner. And then once I kind of get done fishing that section of the dock, I'm going to back up a little bit. I'm going to cast because I got a little backlash here. Getting a backlash is normal. When you're doing this, guys, don't get too worried about it if you're getting backlashed up. And just another tip when you're trying to skip your fishing lure, always try to make sure that you're using some heavier line. This is 20-pound fluorocarbon. I got a 7'4" heavy power fast action Denali Lithium Pro Worm and jig rod. Now all I'm going to do is try to skip this jig then underneath some of these little holes and things as we get to the middle of the dock. So we have these floats, and you can see there's a few gaps in these floats, and as I'm talking here, it's going to be harder for me to actually hit my casts as usual, but there we go. Basically trying to get your jig up underneath those floats, let that bait sink down there, and then work that jig back. And you want to try to get that jig as far back underneath that float as you possibly can. You're going to hit the sides of the floats, you're going to backlash. This is just part of the process. Every jig fisherman I've ever watched fish or have been in the boat with gets backlashes and they hit the sides of the dock. So there's nobody who's perfect. I can usually get a pretty good cast maybe 75% of the time, but 25% of my casts are going to be kind of rough. Now, when you're working this jig, you don't really need to necessarily work it all that much. It's just more of putting that jig in the area because those fish are going to eat it mainly on the fall. So you really just need to get that bait in the general area, let it sink down to the bottom, and hop it once or twice, maybe then reel it in. You don't really need to soak that jig down there, especially in the summertime. In the winter, if there's brush and stuff under the docks, you may want to work the jig a little bit slower, and those fish are a little more lethargic, but right now it's not that big of a deal. And so I'm just going to keep working my jig around this dock, around the side here, trying to skip as best I can. Sometimes when I get to the deeper parts out here, I'm just looking at my forward facing, it's probably about 10 foot on the tip of this dock. I'll swim my jig more so than letting it get all the way down to the bottom. So I'll get it just to the end of that, or underneath that float, and just kind of swim it with my rod, keep that jig coming towards me, because these fish out here are going to be more suspended usually than being down on the bottom. And then you get to the front of the dock now. So the front of the boat dock, basically same exact thing applies. I'm going to try to look around out here with my forward facing just to see if I see any brush piles or anything. I don't see anything out here right now, but sometimes you can find some brush piles, and I usually like to make some casts. Ooh, there's a big old helicopter going by. Make some casts on these outside corners of all of these floating docks, because a lot of times you get spotted bass that'll set up on them, and you can just kind of skip around. You can see I'm making a lot of casts on these docks because you really want to be thorough, hit all these different angles. And now we're getting to kind of the trickier parts. So we're getting to the longer casts underneath these docks. Sometimes there's ropes tying off, there's a pontoon. So here, I'm gonna try to backhand skip. You want to get up underneath that boat dock as far as you can, down, kind of straight down that dock, and work it all the way back to the boat now. This will allow you to really cover that dock from shallower water back out to deeper water. And again, just kind of hopping that jig, swimming it a little bit, and then we're going to bring it back. I usually just make 1 cast per slip. I don't necessarily make a ton of casts, maybe 2 casts. So we're gonna make a couple casts up in there, let that jig just kind of settle down and swim it through. You're not gonna get bit on every dock, guys. You're actually probably only gonna get bit on like 1 out of every 20 docks you fish. So don't get too beat up if you aren't getting bit constantly on these docks. There's a little bit of brush in there, so I'm gonna make a second cast back in there just to see if there's anything going on. I think there's like a Christmas tree or something in there that they put, so that's kind of interesting. I'm gonna work that jig through those pieces of brush. Whenever there's brush in a dock slip, obviously you have a higher chance of getting a population or a group of fish underneath there. So I like to make a couple casts. Then we get to kind of some of these other floating slips. Again, same sort of thing, just skip your jig underneath there. It's not super complicated. The hardest part is honestly just the skipping. As you can see, I'm doing 2 types of skip casts. So I've actually done 3 already, but one type of skip cast is obviously gonna be the forehand skip. So the way I do that is I'm basically going to, oh, 1 second here, got my jig. So this happens sometimes when you have a jig, guys, you're skipping it hard against docks. You can see that jig hook got bent. This does happen at times. So what I'm gonna do is grab a pair of pliers, and this happens with every single jig I've ever had or owned. Whenever you hit it against a dock a little bit too much, it'll bend that jig hook just a tiny bit. It doesn't matter if I'm using like a saltwater hook or anything, it happens on all jigs. So just make sure you keep that hook straight, because you just kind of bang it into the side of those docks sometimes, and it'll cause you to miss fish. And I've missed a lot of fish over the years doing that. Maybe I shouldn't be skipping my jig into the dock so hard. Maybe it's user error there, but anyways, we're good to go. So there's 2 types of skip casts you can use. First, obviously, is just a forehand, just straight ahead skip. And what I'm gonna do is keep my elbow tight to my body, loop that bait, and then try to actually make contact with that water just out in front of me, and then skip that bait, controlling my bait caster spool with my thumb. So that's kind of cast number 1. Cast number 2 is a backhand skip. So like in a situation like this where we have a boat dock here, I guess I could technically forehand skip it, but you can get it underneath there, but it's a little bit tricky. And if the angle's a little bit off, it's always good to also learn a backhand skip. So backhand skip, same principle applies. You're gonna do that circle, but you're just going to backhand it like this. So that hit the pole. That was not great. I was watching my camera. Okay, let's try that again. Anyways, you got that backhand skip cast, which you can skip back underneath there just like that. So that's kind of a second skip cast that you have in your arsenal. And then the third type of skip cast I like to do is actually a pitch skip, where you basically pitch that bait and skip it underneath there. It's great when you're in close quarters, tighter quarters here, and it just makes it a little bit easier to kind of get in and around these docks, especially if you're kind of up close. So just pitch that bait, skip it across the water with a pitch. I know I'm making this look easy. This took me years and years and years to be good at this type of casting. So don't be discouraged if you aren't very good at it at first. I probably spent like, and even I screw it up and do that, which is not what you want to do. But I've spent hundreds of hours casting in my backyard when I was a kid and just practicing when I was on the boat. I've won a couple different junior state championships and a lot of tournaments fishing boat docks and skipping and stuff. And I would say that fishing this way is actually one of my strengths. It's one of the things that I've become pretty good at over the years. So don't get discouraged if you are fishing around these boat docks. Don't get your cast right if you're hitting the docks a lot, because it's part of the process, guys, and it takes years to figure out. But when you do get figured out, you can absolutely crack them on docks. So basically finish up on this dock. We're gonna go around the corner. We're gonna fish all the way around that dock and then kind of get out of the sketchy parts here. And that's pretty much it. So that's how you fish around a boat dock, guys. Again, throwing that motion fishing. Yeah, use a 3/8 or a 1/2 ounce flipping jig, hand-tied skirt, which helps keep that skirt up when you're skipping it around. It has a great bait keeper. Definitely check out some motion fishing jigs if you guys want a great dock skipping jig. Again, 20-pound fluorocarbon line from a main line. That's a Denali lithium 7'4", heavy power, fast action worm and jig rod, and then just an Abu Garcia Max Pro reel 7-to-1 gear ratio. So hope you guys enjoyed this video, and we'll see you in the next Bass Fishing Classified episode.